Number one, Amazon's quick assemble tiny house, priced at less than $10,000, is a compact dwelling with 2 to 3 bedrooms. At number two, the HUD Secretary Scott Turner announced the elimination of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act, which required communities to analyze and address disparities in access to resources in order to qualify for federal grants. Number three, Intel's $20 billion semiconductor plant in New Albany, Ohio has been delayed by at least 3 years, with completion of its first phase now expected between 2030 and 2031. Number four, Governor Gavin Newsom announced stronger accountability measures for California to show measurable progress on homelessness in order to continue receiving state funds. At number five, and our favorite, former Philadelphia Eagles star Jason Kelce has requested zoning approval for modifications to his Delaware County property.
모스트 보던 팟캐스트.
Welcome to Most Modern, the podcast where we explore the why behind our built environment through design, development, and data. I'm Libo Lee, joined by my co-host Alex Yoon. We're missing our third co-host, Minku Kang, due to illness. We hope him a swift recovery. Today, we're trying something a little bit different. In the next 10 minutes or so, we will cover 5 important news stories that impact our built world. So let's begin.
Yeah, Libo, thank you. Let's dive into this Amazon quick tiny house. My take is basically that Amazon recognizes potentially that housing is an immense need. It's quite interesting that a tech giant would start to think about this. Now, let's note that what's being listed is not actually something being produced by Amazon. This isn't the Alexa house necessarily, but it is indications that there are manufacturers that are willing to use Amazon as its platform in order to actually distribute these rapidly deployable, cheap housing units. In this case, it's in the UK, actually. And so in this case, it's 2 to 3 bedrooms, standard size, but within $10,000, £10,000, it's much more affordable than a lot of the housing solutions that we come across in the realtor news.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting that Amazon is this portal to customers, and they started from books, but increasingly people are more and more willing to buy more and more expensive things on Amazon. And buying a house like $10,000 with a one-click buy, that's a lot of money to spend like that. And it does show that, one, the customer has trust in Amazon as a platform, but two, vendors can use that trust as a portal to bring goods to market. And I think if you compare this with a lot of strategies of these ADU companies that are now sprouting up everywhere, they have issues in terms of customer trust, in terms of access to market, that may be solved if they go through Amazon instead.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we were talking about Samara, we're talking about Cottage, these ADU companies that have appeared online that have been trying to help homeowners establish buildings or small granny flats in their backyard, help them sort of understand the legal framework and the planning requirements and the construction requirements necessary. I see this as a potential opportunity for Amazon to get in the game and basically acquire one of those companies. We've noted that I think not one ADU company has really emerged as the market leader. You would imagine that someone with the heft and the checkbook of Amazon could come in there. Plus, it's in Seattle, Amazon's in Seattle, or, they're based in all these places that require housing. So I could see them coming in and maybe saying, if this makes sense on a business standpoint, let's get in the game and let's make the Alexa house. Now, if it's possible, if we can make housing cheaply and affordably and also make it work at the enterprise level, that remains to be seen. But I think it's an interesting development for sure for Jeff Bezos and his friends.
Well, it's another missed opportunity for Sears, which is definitely not outcompeting Amazon right now. But let's move on to our second story. The HUD Secretary eliminating the Affirmative Furthering Fair Housing Act, or I'm just going to call it AFFH. Both a tongue twister. This is something that I feel like you specifically probably has some expertise in helping us understand, like, what is being eliminated? How does it impact how we can build housing in such a crucial time when we just need more and more of it?
Yeah, so the AFFH is a provision in the Fair Housing Act of 1968 that essentially requires federal agencies and subsequent entities that are receiving federal housing funds to develop affordable housing, presumably, to actively, quote, promote housing and address racial segregation and discrimination. So obviously, the lack of housing or access to housing is directly correlated to social and economic class. I think that there's a huge history of the way that housing has been used to discriminate. And if we talk to Yoni Applebaum, for instance, in a recent episode, he'll lay out that history quite clearly. So what this seems to be is this sort of flipping back and forth between Republican and Democratic administration, starting in the Obama administration, between tightening the screws on the requirements that the AFFH stipulates and then loosening them. So Obama basically made it more onerous, added more requirements. And then Trump in Trump 1 decided to pull that back. Now, there's two, I think, underthreads here. One is basically, do we want density in our suburbs or do we want our suburbs to remain suburbs? And Trump famously said that he thinks that the suburbs should remain suburbs. Of course, there is also racial undertones that people have suggested around that, saying this is discriminatory. This is part of a larger agenda to promote sort of segregation within society. I think that might be at play, but I would like to address maybe the other concern, which is this AFFH actually making it more difficult to create housing on large? Like, if you have to dedicate more resources to addressing certain requirements, certain, I guess, wrongs through racial discrimination, Obama basically said you have to create a report, essentially. And as a developer and an architect, that's just one more report onto a long list of all these requirements that we have to do in order to make housing. So is it something that's actually de-incentivizing people from producing housing? Potentially. Now, I think this also goes back to this idea that suburbs and the cities should remain different. And more specifically, what this does by rolling these requirements back is the Trump administration is essentially giving more power and more influence to local jurisdictions to decide how much housing is in their neighborhood and how much housing is produced. Now, I think as somebody who recognizes the need for more housing, I don't think that's the right thing to do, because neighborhoods will just go with the status quo and people will vote in their interests, which predominantly are, let's just keep the neighborhood the way it is. At the same time, the rest of society is struggling because there just isn't enough housing. And I agree with Yoni in our previous episode that probably lands at the state level to create more requirements, or at least more, let's say, create a shot clock or create a target score for local jurisdictions in order to meet their housing requirements. And if they don't, there are consequences. You get funding cut in other places. So the states might have this agenda, but it seems like the federal government is trying to circumvent that and trying to prevent that as well, which at the same time is not out of line with Republican and Democratic politics, where you have one party that promotes small government and one party that promotes more involved government.
So will we end up with more housing as a consequence of this, or less?
Well, I think it's really hard to say because it's going to depend on the jurisdictions. And, only a portion of funding that goes into affordable housing, let's say multifamily apartment style affordable housing, that could be entering into less dense regions, more suburban environments, is coming from the federal government. It is a significant portion, and every dollar counts when you're building affordable housing, but it's not the be-all, end-all, and there's other ways to finance projects as well. So I think from a practical side, I would welcome anything that makes it easier, in the sense that I don't have to hit as many requirements when I'm trying to develop or design affordable housing. At the same time, is it just a wrecking ball strategy that we've seen played out in this administration over and over again, where it's like, let's just get rid of everything and see how things turn out? I think nuance is still valuable and balance is important. But, I think it does raise a question, like, do you want more housing or do you want better housing for certain types of people? And that balance is always something that society needs to figure out. And in this case, the administration is taking a stand and saying, no, let's just make it easier, presumably, to create more housing. I think this is also a difference in Trump 1 versus Trump 2. Trump 1 really didn't care about HUD. He put Ben Carson in there. It was I don't think he took it very seriously. Now he also recognizes that making sure his constituency and his voters are well housed and that they're happy with their environment, physical environment, seems to be kind of a priority.
Let's move on to the other struggle that the US is having with building something. Intel's $20 billion semiconductor plant in Ohio. We've heard a lot about onshoring, chip war, the AI war. Now Intel's fab has been delayed 3 years and we're expecting it in 2030 or 2031 to come online. 5 years is a long time. And if we're really fighting this war and we can't get things built, how successful will we be?
I don't know, Libo. I mean, I think this is an interesting case, particularly because it's Intel. But let's just take it from the macro standpoint. The US is trying to onshore more advanced manufacturing, right? And there's two components to that. One is actually building the facilities that can produce those things. And then two is bringing in the laborers and the workers who can actually operate those facilities. The second has already seem to be quite difficult. And it seems like Taiwan has a lock on both. I was in Taiwan a month ago, and just in Taichung, you walk around and you see these giant fabs. They're kind of invisible in the sense that like they just fit in, but they are massive, and they obviously are big boxes, but very complex boxes on the inside. So I think this is not necessarily encouraging at all. At the same time, I also wonder if this is an Intel problem, given the state of that company.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about how Intel was this world leader and has now kind of been struggling, and the US really needs a domestic champion, especially in this space. Given the geopolitical risks of having so much risk, I guess, concentrated in TSMC and the recent struggles with TSMC trying to build a fab in Arizona. So, I mean, I guess from my standpoint, it's like what we ideally would want is a domestic champion who has manufacturing capabilities in the US so that we're protected from any future risk where our supply of chips might come under risk. But it seems that we are now at a point where it's very hard for us to get there. We've kind of lost that ability to build, we've lost that ability to manufacture, and building up that ecosystem and that infrastructure all over again is gonna take more than, I think, just a $500 AI bill, $500 billion AI bill from the government.
Yeah, and I think this is a little bit similar to building housing, but it's also very dissimilar. I mean, these are different types of projects. They take a lot more complexity. You're not dealing with neighborhood associations. You're dealing with contractors and cities that want tax incentives, and it's a different economics than it is when it comes to building more housing. But it is an important problem that I think America needs to address. Like, we can build things in the cloud, we can build things virtually, but can we build things physically? And do we want to be that nation that can still build those big projects? China is clearly like way ahead in terms of can do. Like, the amount of high-speed rail, the amount of bridges, the amount of airports and other forms of infrastructure are pretty impressive when you relate it to the West. And this is one thing that I do agree with the Trump administration about. It is a bit embarrassing that our airports look the way they do when you go to the Middle East or you go to Asia, and they just look sparkling and much cleaner. What is interesting, though, is this is Ohio. This is not California. And so there's a lot of, I think, political resentment against California for its inability to build large projects, and especially to house people, to build housing, which we'll get to in a second. But this is a blue state. Sorry, this is a red state in the case of Ohio that is also facing similar issues, albeit around a different type of product. So it is not just a left versus right issue. It seems to be an American issue in terms of, can we actually get stuff built?
So I guess one last note on that. I think with everything we're trying to build, more data centers for AI, more electrification, more nuclear, more power, more renewables, chip fabs are competing for the same type of high-skilled labor. These guys are hard to train, they're hard to find, and if we want to do everything at once, we're going to have to figure out a solution where we can get a lot more people trained at this high level a lot faster. So I don't know if that's accelerate training programs, maybe it's removing some red tape in terms of qualifications and certification, but right now it just seems like it's going to be very hard for us to catch up.
Well, one thing I would say is America has an incredible academic ecosystem, and that some of these universities, of which there's actually a profound density in the Midwest, in Ohio specifically, could be the training ground for people to then move into these advanced manufacturing careers. And I think that's sort of hopeful, but I think it's quite feasible too. Give people something to do, give people something to construct and build, especially men. But you also need to create the setting for them to do that in. So I'm sort of in line with this. I think that it makes a ton of sense on a national level, on a economy level. But again, the big idea could be great, but you just have to execute at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Well, talking about execution, this has been a long-standing problem in California, but recently the governor, Gavin Newsom, has announced stronger accountability measures and $920 million in new funding to address homelessness in California. How do you think this will impact the problem?
Well, there's two ways of looking at it. Is this something that he's doing right now because he feels like it's politically infeasible to continue with the status quo, and he needs to infuse the economy with the support for homelessness? It's clear that it's a major issue socially, economically, and just culturally in California. It's not a good place to be, the streets of San Francisco or LA, either as someone who is housed or somebody who is living on those streets specifically. And it's created a really bad brand for the state, I think. So My worry is that whenever there's somebody in power who has the ability to authorize funds or resources towards something, they're doing it from their own political gains, which is probably the case. I mean, I can't expect a politician to do anything other than that right now. I wish we lived in a society where people did the right thing, even if it didn't benefit them politically. You know, $920 million seems like a lot, but the amount of money that we already spend on homelessness is quite a lot already. And I'm not sure if this is going to move the needle necessarily. That being said, it is also quite interesting because people have said, look, one of the reasons why we have the LA fires is because we dedicate so many resources actually to dealing with homelessness and the drug issues in LA and other places, and that those resources could actually be better spent fighting the fires, doing controlled burns, managing the brush, things of that nature. I don't know. This isn't something that's really making waves for me in California right now. I think people are just more concerned about the general state of the economy largely. If wood is 20% more expensive because of tariffs, what's that going to do in terms of providing housing rather than this $920 million stimulus that Newsom is proposing right now?
It's just so surprising that like in the most innovative, the richest state in America, close to $1 billion is not really going to make a dent on what probably everyone agrees is the biggest problem facing the state right now.
Yeah, the budget of San Francisco is larger than 17 US states, including pretty big ones like Oklahoma and New Mexico. So we don't lack money. I mean, that's pretty clear. The question is, do we want to just be that, like rich but dysfunctional? And I think that there are politicians out there who are still okay with that. And I think this is one of the issues with having a political elite that is really financed by just people who don't have to deal with homelessness because they have big houses or they have other ways of avoiding it. But for the average person, having to take your kids to school and walk through somebody who's shooting up heroin is not fun. And it's not something that we should necessarily valorize. Now, it's a complicated issue. And trust me, I know a lot about this because we do our projects basically for people who need to be housed. It is not easy to even just bring people off the street and put them into housing. There's a lot of things that you need to do to support them because these are people that oftentimes don't want to live in housing. They often want to live in the street. And so when you talk about the Tenderloin in San Francisco or Skid Row in LA, those are communities actually that have been built up over time that have attracted people because of a lifestyle, like any community. Now that lifestyle is not necessarily something that you or I want to be a part of, but for certain people who have certain requirements or are used to who use certain substances or whatnot, that is what they want to go towards in a lot of ways. And so I think it's an incredibly difficult issue. And I think my concern is mostly, are we just throwing money at it to make ourselves feel like we're doing something? Hard to say, but there will definitely be more money to come. No doubt about it.
Rich but dysfunctional. What a great description of where we are today, especially as a country. But I think on a lighter note to end on, let's talk about Jason Kelce's request for zoning approval. Despite being a superstar, despite being a Super Bowl champion, he still has to go in front of the town board to get variances for his property. Can you tell us a little bit of what that's like? And is this a very American thing where we expect even our superstars to get the same variances as our common folk, let's say?
Well, shout out to Jason Kelce. I think he has emerged. I think he's retired now, but he's emerged as sort of a man of the people. He's out there with his shirt off and having a good time, generally speaking. Look, I think this is nice. It is good to know that even if you're rich and famous, you also have to go through the same pain points that we do as normal folk to actually get stuff done. And, he's talking about Delaware County, Delco in Philadelphia. My family's from there too. I know what it's like. It's very suburban. A lot of Philadelphia sports stars live around there. He's not going to have a problem. He just has to go through the process. But there have been moments where celebrities have gotten in the way of other built environment concerns that have caused them problems. Like in my backyard, Steph Curry down in Atherton, talk about a wealthy community. He opposed basically affordable housing, multifamily housing near his block. His opposition was on the basis of privacy. He was worried that taller buildings could see into his lot. And everyone loves Steph Curry. The guy he will never have to pay for a meal in the Bay Area, but that did get people annoyed. And that there are still people who talk about him as a NIMBY. I don't know how much of that he personally had to play a role in that. But look, I think we're in a country where we expect people to be treated fairly equally. Now, there are definitely real exceptions to that. I'm not going to pretend like there aren't. But for the most part, I'm glad to see that he's able to do this. And, An athlete is one thing. The worst is when it's the politician who gets to levy and impose restrictions on people, but then gets to cut the line and go around the back and get things done. And that has definitely happened in a lot of places. I think that's called corruption.
Well, I feel like we're definitely at a time where we'll be seeing a lot of that. That's one of the biggest pushbacks to the city of Yes, where New York has kind of rezoned neighborhoods to allow more building, but the neighborhoods that magically did not get rezoned are the same neighborhoods that the politicians who pushed the bill through live in.
Naturally, of course.
Yeah, it's something I'm sure we'll cover more in the coming episodes, but thank you, our audience, for your time. We hope that was informative and enjoyable. Please leave us a comment below and like and subscribe to support this channel. Stay tuned for our usual interviews. We release every Tuesday here on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you.
Most podden.
Most modern.
Most podden.
Most podern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트